Okay, we're going to do one more example for using a chi-square test, and that's an association between two categorical variables. So in this example, we're going to talk about the predicted relationship between saguaro cacti and nurse shrubs. And so there's this kind of lore that saguaro cacti only really colonize the desert when the seed lands underneath a shrub that can provide some protection from the harsh conditions. And then the saguaro cactus kind of grows up through the shrub, and then sometimes outcompetes the shrub or outlives the shrub. So we're gonna test this with some real data we could observe just from a photograph of the saguaro of the Sonoran Desert. So we're gonna see whether some real data fit this model, whether we more often find saguaro cacti in association with shrubs or not. And so we can just take a picture like this of the Sonoran Desert. This is in the Superstition Mountains outside of Apache Junction, Arizona. And you can see saguaros in the picture, and then you can also see when they're growing kind of next to shrubs or not. And so what we would do is we go through each of these cells, and we would decide if there's a saguaro inside, if there's a shrub inside, or if there's both. And when we look just at the saguaros, we can see sometimes they're with shrubs, and those would be blue, and sometimes they're growing without shrubs, and those would be red. So if we tabulated all of these data into a table, we would end up with a table like this: shrub, yes, no; cactus, yes, no. And there are 88 cells where there's neither a shrub nor a cactus. And what we would do then, again, we would calculate the row totals and the column totals. You can see those values in gray in the top table. And then we would calculate the expected values. And again, it's the row total times the column total for that cell divided by the overall sample size, which is 103 in this case. And so you can see how you would calculate those expected values in the second table at the bottom. And then you would compare each observed value to each expected value, square it, and divide by the expected value. So we use the same equation, this chi-squared equation, to calculate the overall chi-square value for your data set. Then we would compare it to a table of chi-square values and see whether or not there was a significant association between saguaros and nurse plants. And we can do all of these calculations honestly with a calculator, but you can also do them in Excel. You can decide which one you want to use for the lab. You can also import the data into JUMP, and we can run these tests there. So the lab will walk you through all of those methods. And here's some details. So you always want to run these tests on the raw numbers. You don't want to run these tests on percentage data. Okay, so don't calculate percentages of things, other than in the first example where we use the percentage of the habitat to calculate the expected values. We don't want to use the data themselves weren't percentage values. Okay, so make sure the numbers are raw counts. And then in general, when we build these contingency tables, the response variables are recorded as the columns, and the explanatory variables are the rows. Though with the cactus and the shrub example, neither one is really dependent. Well, I guess the cactus would be more dependent on the shrubs if you wanted to think about it that way. Some other details are that these data sets really don't like a whole lot of zeros. So if you have a data set with a whole lot of zeros, you might have some difficulty. Okay, so that's really the main part of the lab. And then the rest of what I'm going to talk about are some extensions you might be interested in learning about. So the first one is logistic regression. This would be an example where you have a categorical response variable y, but you have a continuous explanatory variable. So an example might be maximum summer temperatures influencing the mortality of cottonwood trees. Okay, so you might say, well, as the temperatures increase, you might get more and more mortality. In this case, mortality is your response variable, and temperature is your independent variable. This type of experiment would be analyzed using logistic regression. And so here's just a silly example showing your success at hitting a trash can as you move the trash can farther away when you're throwing a wad of paper. But what it shows is this nice kind of S-shaped curve that you should get from a logistic regression, going either down or going up. And so here's an example on the bottom right-hand side. You can see logistic regression where you have lizard mortality and lizard density. Okay, so, and you see this pattern looks really similar to logistic growth curve, right? And so we're learning about logistic growth curves and that this would be a good example of that. All right. The last example, well, I guess what I'll say is that it's possible to have many X's for both of these things, okay? And so you can have multi-way contingency tables where you have more than one independent variable influencing your response variable. You can have multiple logistic regression, where you have, again, more than one X variable influencing, say, mortality or something like that. And then we can use what are called CART models. Classification and regression tree models are really cool. They can deal with many X and many Y variables, or sorry, they can deal with both categorical and continuous X's and one Y variable. And the Y variable can be either categorical or continuous. So we'll talk a little bit more. CART models are an advanced technique, but they're kind of fun to play with. And so I'm just going to give you a little exposure to them. So classification and regression tree models can use a mixture of both continuous and categorical X variables. And how they work is they take your Y variable, and in this case, I think we'll just consider it a continuous Y variable. And they can take that Y variable and then they split it into two parts, depending on what single or independent variable best can divide it into two parsimonious groups. And so that could be a categorical variable. It could be a continuous variable, greater than 5 and less than 5. Okay, and so and then it takes each of those chunks of data and it splits them further. It's making kind of a dichotomous tree out of your data. And so you can see an example here showing data from 3 different species of iris, which we'll get to play with in the lab. And the first split is on petal length. So it says, okay, species of this red type have petal lengths less than 3, say, centimeters. And then species of these other 2 types have petal lengths greater than or equal to 3. And then of the 2, where you can see the blue and the green species together, then the second split would be at petal width. You can see it does a pretty good job of splitting the species by petal width, although you get a few of the blue species over there in the petal width less than 1.8 box. But most of the blue species are in petal width greater than 1.8. And then you can see it's trying to split out that green and a little bit of blue group even further based on petal length greater than 5. And so this is a nice method to learn. It's kind of people would argue that it's a data mining method, meaning that you just kind of throw a bunch of data into something and then you can kind of like use it to see what patterns emerge. And some people feel very strongly that data mining is not something we should do. It doesn't have a clear hypothesis test, but it can really help you see complex patterns in ecological data. And so I'm not a total, I'm a fan, I'm a tentative fan of carbon modeling. Okay, so we can also expand on what we've learned, and you can have many Y variables too. And so we're going to talk about these things as we go, but some examples of many Y variables, ordination methods, permutative, multivariate ANOVAs, and tell tests, and indicator species analysis. And so we're going to get into some of these more complex things later on. I want you to start off with this core group of 4 boxes. And we're going to work through ANOVA and regression and correlation in the next 2 labs so that you really understand these 4 boxes. And then we're going to kind of expand. All right. So we'll see you next time.